Just a nurse playing hero. That was what Dr. Richard Sterling said, his voice carrying across the break room like a knife through silk. 3 other staffers looked up from their lukewarm coffee. Katie Morrison didn't flinch. She had learned, over 8 months at Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah, that flinching was a luxury she could no longer afford. They didn't know who was standing at the sink rinsing a chipped ceramic mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse." They didn't know that the hands gripping that mug had once steadied a bleeding soldier while rounds from a PKM machine gun stitched the wall behind her. They didn't know that the woman in rumpled Navy scrubs with a trauma shears clipped to her waistband had carried a 220-pound Navy SEAL 3 kilometers through Ramadi's burning streets on nothing but adrenaline and the kind of calm that only comes when you've already survived the worst. Katie had chosen anonymity like some people choose religion. The morning shift began at 6:36 a.m., the way it always did. Sacred Heart's emergency department smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, that particular chemical-organic blend that became background noise after a while. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in their mechanical hymn. Katie moved through the pre-shift briefing without speaking unless spoken to, taking notes on admission reports in handwriting so precise it looked like a signature block from a military document. Chest pain in Bay 3. Post-op abdominal in Bay 6. Suspected pneumonia in observation. The usual rhythm of a 286-bed hospital that saw everything from minor lacerations to the kinds of traumas that made young doctors question their career choices. Her shift supervisor, Denise, handed off a tablet running the bed management system. "You're on post-op oversight today. Mostly cleanups from yesterday's surgical roster. Keep eyes on the guy in 314, post-op day 1 from cardiac repair, still pretty groggy." Katie nodded. She had a way of nodding that made you feel heard without quite feeling seen. The nursing station occupied a corner of the ED where every monitor could be observed simultaneously. 3 nurses rotated through the station every 2 hours. 2 of them, Rebecca and Marcus, exchanged glances when Katie logged into the computer system. Not quite hostile. Not quite welcoming. That particular flavor of workplace neutrality that tasted like dismissal when you weren't paying attention, and like mercy when you were. By 7:15 a.m., Katie had already caught something the night shift had documented incorrectly. The patient in Bay 8, admitted with suspected pneumonia, had a heart rate that had climbed from 88 to 106 over 4 hours. The chest X-ray showed something subtle in the right lung field, not pneumonia. Pulmonary embolism. Small but present. She flagged it without fanfare, the way you'd point out a typo in an email. The attending physician checked her notation, clicked his tongue against his teeth, and ordered a CT angiogram. No thanks. No acknowledgement. Just a brief nod that meant you saved someone from a misdiagnosis, now stop existing. This was Katie's architecture. Catch what others missed. Fix it quietly. Disappear. She moved between bays with the fluid precision of someone who had learned to be useful without being noticed. Her scrubs were creased at the edges. Her name badge, just Katie Morrison, RN, hung at exactly the same angle as everyone else's. She had learned to match the background. No tattoos visible. Hair pulled back. Shoes white and sensible. Every surface of her blended into the institutional beige of the hospital's infrastructure. The trauma shears clipped to her waistband were from a tactical supply company most nurses had never heard of. They were marked on the handle with initials in permanent marker, kilometer. Nobody asked about them. Nobody asked about the way she moved through code situations with the kind of reflexive confidence that came from training in candlelight and gunfire instead of simulation labs. At 8:22 a.m., the doors to the ED opened and 2 paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man who was still sedated from anesthesia, post-op cardiac surgery just 18 hours prior. Commander James Pierce, according to the transfer paperwork. Age 43. Navy SEAL. Stable vitals, excellent surgical repair from his procedure at Savannah Memorial. Just needed 24-hour post-op observation and pain management at Sacred Heart before discharge to outpatient recovery. Katie read the paperwork without looking up. Then she looked up. The patient's left forearm was visible where the blanket had shifted. A tattoo. Black ink. Block letters. Morrison stretched across the inside of his forearm in lettering that looked like it had been done in a base medical clinic or a military tattoo artist's chair, the kind of ink that was meant to mean something. Her breath didn't catch. Her heart didn't race. The trembling that had plagued her hands for 3 years after her last deployment didn't resurface. These were the tools of people who got caught. Instead, Katie simply noted the detail, filed it, and moved forward. Commander Pierce was rolled into Bay 314, the private observation room reserved for post-op cardiac patients. His family was already there, a woman in her 60s with his jawline, a younger man with his shoulders, a teenage girl holding a phone she wasn't using. They looked scared the way families do when someone they love has just been cut open and sewn back together, when the fragility of everything has been revealed in surgical detail. Katie checked the monitors. Heart rhythm regular. Oxygen saturation 96%. Blood pressure holding at 118/72. She adjusted the forward drip, made sure the pain pump was accessible, ran through the checklist with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Which she had. Just not all of those times had been in civilian hospitals. He'll need to move around soon, she told the family. Her voice was quiet. Rehearsed. The voice of someone who had learned to speak without taking up space. Walking helps prevent clots. We'll start with sitting up in the chair around noon, then short walks in the corridor. The mother nodded. The father asked about pain medication. Katie explained the patient-controlled analgesia pump. Professional. Distant. Invisible. She didn't look at the tattoo again. By 9:38 a.m., Dr. Richard Sterling arrived for his rounds. Sterling was a cardiac surgeon who had built his reputation on exactly 3 things: a face that photographed well in hospital fundraising materials, a gift for speaking to donors at black tie galas, and a strategic alliance with the hospital board's president, who had been his fraternity brother at Duke Medical School. He was 58 years old and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from always being the smartest person in the room before he ever opened his mouth. His tie was a shade of blue that cost more than Katie's monthly rent. His shoes were Italian leather. His watch was a Rolex that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in silver arcs. He moved through the ward with an entourage, 2 residents, a medical student, and a nurse he preferred for rounds named Jennifer, who laughed at his jokes and took notes in a leather journal with his monogram embossed on the cover. Katie worked the morning shift in Bay 3 and Bay 5, handling dressing changes and medication administration with the kind of methodical precision that left no room for conversation. She heard Sterling's voice before she saw him. Confident. Loud. The kind of volume that filled corridors and made smaller voices stop trying. Post-op day 2 abdominal repair. Bowel sounds active. We'll start clear liquids today. Then his voice shifted. Not the clinical tone. The social tone. The tone that made people believe whatever came next. You know what I've always found remarkable about nursing? It requires no intuition whatsoever. Just following protocol. Just exactly doing what you're told. Katie was in Bay 3, adjusting and fall line. She didn't turn around. I've seen nurses make decisions that would have been laughable if they weren't so dangerous, Sterling continued. His audience was the residents. 2 young men who would learn everything about medicine from him and almost nothing about healing. The temptation to overstep. To think that because you've memorized a few procedures, you've suddenly earned the right to practice medicine. The medical student laughed. By 10:15 a.m., Sterling entered Bay 314 with his entourage. Katie was not present. She was in the break room, sitting alone at a table with a protein bar she wasn't eating and a chart she was reading. This was her pattern. Eat when others were elsewhere. Rest when others were working. Exist in the gaps. She heard his voice escalate from 314. Heard the family responding. Heard the pause that meant he had seen something. She heard the door open again at 10:33 a.m. Nurse Morrison. Sterling was standing at the threshold of the break room. His jaw was set in that particular configuration that men with unchecked authority developed after enough years of getting exactly what they wanted. I need you to explain something to me. Your notation from the night shift. You logged the patient in 314 as having full baseline awareness post-op. Yet when I examined him just now, he appears quite sedated. Confused, even. Perhaps more confused than a patient should be at this stage. Katie set down her protein bar. She stood with the kind of economy of motion that suggested every gesture had been calculated long ago. The sedation wears off unpredictably. Some patients respond to anesthesia after effects differently. He was alert when I'm not asking for a hypothesis, Ms. Morrison. I'm asking for an explanation for why your assessment doesn't match observable reality. Behind him, the residents watched. Jennifer watched. The hallway had developed that particular quality of silence that happens when people realize something is being said that is intended to hurt. Katie took one measured breath. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped half an octave, though no one listening could have quite explained why that made her seem more vulnerable rather than less. The patient was alert when I assessed him at 6:13 a.m. His post-operative timeline is still within normal parameters for sedation variance. My documentation was accurate at the time of observation. Sterling smiled. It was the smile of someone who had just confirmed something he'd been suspecting. Well, that's quite a defense of a simple discrepancy. Perhaps next time you'll remember that interpretation isn't part of your job description. Documentation is. And interpretation is medicine. He turned and walked back down the hallway. Jennifer followed. The residents followed. And in the break room, Katie sat back down and picked up her protein bar, and the trembling didn't start until after her shift ended, when she was sitting in her 2009 Honda Civic in the Sacred Heart parking lot with the windows fogged and her hands gripped around the steering wheel like she was still holding a rifle. The thing about walking away from a war was that the war had a way of following you home. She had left active duty 3 years ago, after 18 years of service, after 2 Bronze Stars and a Silver Star, and 3 Purple Hearts had become less like accomplishments and more like evidence of her own continued survival. Her hands had started shaking during her last deployment. Simple things. Holding a syringe. Threading and the muscle memory that had kept her alive in Ramadi, Helmand Province, and 6 other places the government preferred not to acknowledge, had begun to betray her in peacetime. A psychiatrist at Walter Reed had diagnosed it as PTSD with complex trauma features. Which was military speak for, you have seen too much. Your nervous system is calibrated for a level of threat that no longer exists. Your body is preparing for a war that is over. Katie had been offered disability, full pension, therapy, a transition support program that had a 60% completion rate and a 40% suicide rate among participants. Instead, she had asked for a discharge. Honorable. Clean. She had listed her civilian employment prospects as the healthcare because it was true and incomplete, the way the best lies always are. She had not told her sister that she had left the service. Her sister still believed she was deployed. Katie had not corrected her. She had taken a bus to Savannah because it was far enough from Fort Bragg to feel like a different country, and close enough to the ocean to remind her that other kinds of movements existed besides tactical. She had rented an efficiency apartment for $680 a month. She had applied to Sacred Heart's nursing department with credentials that were impeccable and references that were obscure. She had become invisible. And for 8 months, it had almost worked. The combat boots were in the bottom of her apartment closet, wrapped in plastic that had begun to yellow. They were still dirty. Still marked with the dust of Ramadi, the scuff patterns of 1,000 patrols, the stress marks of a woman running on adrenaline and field rations, and the belief that if she stopped moving, she would fall down and never get up. She had not worn them since her last patrol. She had not talked about any of this since her discharge interview. Katie Morrison, RN, was not a senior chief petty officer anymore. That woman had been left behind in the desert, or in the hospitals, or in the spaces between, the parts of her that had remained in the places where she had been useful, because usefulness had been the only thing that made sense. She had become a nurse because healing people without needing to be thanked, without needing to be acknowledged, without needing to exist as anything more than a set of competent hands and a mind that could calculate trajectories and triage decisions in the split second between life and death, that felt like redemption. Instead, she was sitting in a parking lot in Savannah, Georgia, with her hand shaking on a steering wheel, listening to Dr. Richard Sterling's voice echo in her head like a taunt, like a challenge, like the beginning of something she had hoped she had left behind. And in Bay 314, a man with her name tattooed on his arm was waking up to a post-operative world, his fractured memory still unable to place the face of the woman who had saved his life 3 years ago in a place called Ramadi. The break room fell silent when Katie walked in on Thursday afternoon at 2:13 p.m. 5 staff members sat scattered around the small table, 2 nurses from cardiac, an orderly, a resident. Their conversation died mid-sentence. Within 30 seconds, all 5 stood and left without speaking, their exodus moving like a coordinated retreat. Katie watched the resident's coffee cup steam on the table, abandoned mid-sip. She didn't flinch. She didn't follow them. She simply sat where the resident had been sitting and opened her lunch container, a sandwich she had no appetite to eat. In the hallway outside, Sterling's voice reached her ears even through the closed door, a low murmur directed at the resident. "I just don't know about her judgment," he was saying. "Questionable choices. You saw how she handled that sedation question in rounds. Experienced nurses don't second-guess protocol like that. Something about her feels off. I'm concerned about what might happen if we're not careful." The resident's reply was inaudible, but his nervous laugh carried through the wall. Katie sat motionless, her sandwich untouched. She understood the tactic. Whisper doubt. Let others fill in the blanks. Let them fear what they didn't understand. She had seen this before, not in Ramadi, but in the aftermath. In the hospital where she'd tried to heal before the tremor in her hands became unbearable, before the nightmares made her a liability. Before she'd chosen to disappear. By Friday morning, the formal write-up had been posted on the unit board in a nursing station where every staff member could read it. Katie's name. Her shift. A summary of failure to follow established sedation protocols and unsupervised modification of physician orders. The handwriting was Sterling's, that precise, institutional script that belonged to someone who had never questioned whether policy served patients or protected physicians. No one made eye contact with Katie when she passed the board. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. A nurse named Jennifer, who had shared stories about her daughter's swim team 3 days earlier, now took her charts and relocated to another station rather than work beside her. Sterling found her at 3:44 p.m. in the hallway near the medication room. He moved with the confidence of a man whose name appeared in hospital fundraising newsletters and donor plaques. His tie, a burgundy silk thing that probably cost more than Katie's weekly grocery budget, was knotted with the precision of someone who had never had to dress in darkness. His voice, when he spoke, carried the particular timbre of institutional authority, the sound of a man who had learned to weaponize his own certainty. "We need to talk about your future here, Katie." He used her first name the way a prosecutor might, as evidence of informality where none existed. "I'm genuinely concerned about your approach to medicine. You're playing hero. That's not how we operate at Sacred Heart. We follow protocols. We defer to the attending. You seem to have a problem with hierarchy. That's dangerous. It puts patients at risk. It puts me in a position where I have to question whether you should be here at all." Katie stood still for 3 seconds. Her hands, those hands that had held intestines inside a torso while mortar rounds shook the compound, that had performed emergency field tracheostomies in the dark with nothing but a combat knife and a ballpoint pen, remained at her sides. One breath in. One breath out. She looked at him directly. When she spoke, her voice came out like someone addressing a junior enlisted soldier who had forgotten what respect meant. "I've triaged better men than you'll ever be while they were dying, Doctor. I can certainly survive your insecurity." The words landed in the space between them like something physical. Sterling's face went rigid. His jaw worked silently for a moment, searching for a response, finding nothing adequate. A nurse passing with a medication cart slowed her pace, hearing the tone in Katie's voice, something that didn't match the write-up, something that didn't align with a junior staff member. Katie turned and walked toward Bay 314 without waiting for his reply. Behind her, Sterling's hand clenched into a fist, then released. He was already calculating his next move, already thinking about phone calls he would make, connections he would leverage. Room 314 was dim when Katie entered at 6:22 p.m. Commander Pierce lay in the post-op recovery position, his shoulder heavily bandaged, monitors tracking his heart's determined rhythm. His eyes were open but unfocused, that particular unfocused quality of someone still traveling between the waking world and the one created by post-surgical medications. Katie checked his vitals, BP stable at 127/71, oxygen saturation steady at 98%, heart rate in the 60s, the kind of rhythm that meant the body was healing. She didn't speak. She simply performed the assessment with the economical movement of someone who had done it 10,000 times before, maybe more. As she was turning to leave, Pierce's right hand lifted slightly. His forearm caught the fluorescent light. The tattoo was visible then, block letters, clean black ink, the kind of permanent memorial that Marines and SEALs carried when they wanted to remember something they could never lose. Morrison. Her last name. For letters that meant she had dragged him out of the wreckage of an IED blast in Ramadi 3 years ago, when his collarbone was shattered and his bleeding was what kept her moving forward instead of staying frozen. She had carried him 2.8 kilometers across desert that burned your lungs just to breathe it, while Ramadi burned around them like the world was ending. His eyes moved toward her. For a moment, his medication-blurred gaze seemed to focus. Their eyes met. Katie waited, holding perfectly still, giving him the space to remember. But his eyes slid away again, returning to the ceiling. He didn't know her. The name on his arm meant nothing to him because the face in his memory was fragmented by trauma and time and 3 years of surgery and rehabilitation. Katie left the room without saying anything. She didn't need to be remembered. She had carried him to safety once. That was enough. That had always been enough. In the hallway, she passed Sterling entering the nursing station with his phone in hand. He was already dialing, already moving to the next phase, the one where he would leverage every connection he had ever cultivated. He would call the hospital board president, a fraternity brother from a university where Katie had never enrolled. He would contact the temp agency that handled her paperwork, speaking in low institutional tones about her stability. He would bring in a risk management consultant from outside, someone without relationships to protect, someone who could write clean clinical language around the word sabotage. But that was all still coming. For now, Katie walked toward the medication room, her hand steady, her breathing level, her composure intact. The ache in her chest, that particular ache that came from seeing someone she had saved, someone whose blood had stained her uniform, stare at her name without recognizing the woman who carried it, that she kept to herself. That belonged to her alone. That was hers to carry, the way she had carried him, the way she would carry everything until someone finally asked her to stop. That night, Commander Pierce lay in room 314 with the heart monitor tracing its steady rhythm across the screen, the green line a reassurance that his body was healing what his mind could not yet remember. Katie had checked on him at 2,100 hours, the habit of military time never left her tongue even if she kept it silent, and his vitals had been stable. Pressure steady. Oxygen good. The kind of quiet that meant the body was doing its job. She'd written everything in the chart with the precision of someone who understood that documentation was a second form of prayer, a record that said, I was here, I paid attention, I gave a damn. But hospitals teach you not to trust quiet. Quiet is what comes before the storm. The beeping started small. A single irregular note in the monitor's rhythm at 02 for 7 hours. Katie was 3 floors down, sitting in the break room with her cold coffee and a textbook she wasn't reading, when the change in air pressure registered first, that subtle drop in atmospheric calm that meant something had shifted. Her body knew before her conscious mind did. The monitor's rhythm accelerated, faster, the beeping becoming urgent, a series of sharp notes that echoed through the unit's corridors like a warning no one else seemed to understand yet. She was on her feet before the call bell rang. When she reached room 314, Commander Pierce's eyes were wide, his hand pressed against his chest like he was trying to hold something in. His breathing came shallow and fast, panicked, the kind of breath that happens when the body knows it's not getting enough oxygen. The blood pressure cuff on the monitor read 84/52 and falling, dropping like a stone through deep water. 90 seconds earlier it had been 128/74. The change was catastrophic. She could see it in the way his chest heaved, in the way his fingers dug into the hospital gown, in the terrified clarity of a man whose body had turned traitor. "What's happening?" His voice came out broken, scared. Katie's hands were already moving, her mind cataloguing the clinical picture with the cold precision of someone who had triaged wounded operators in the field. The sudden onset. The shallow breathing. The plummeting blood pressure. The panic. She looked at his chest and saw what the monitor confirmed. The CVP line above his collarbone was starting to bulge slightly, a subtle swelling that meant fluid was accumulating in the wrong place. Cardiac tamponade. The heart sac filling with blood, compressing the organ, strangling it from the outside. She had seen this before, but never in this light, never with her name tattooed on the arm of the man dying in front of her. "Call for Sterling." "Now," she said to the RN who had appeared in the doorway, but there was no request in her voice anymore, just command. "And get me a crash cart and a pericardiocentesis kit. 14-gauge angiocath, sterile field, all of it. 2 minutes." The RN hesitated for exactly 1 second, long enough for Katie to know that the hierarchy Sterling had spent 3 weeks constructing was still holding, was still telling this woman that orders don't come from the junior nurse in scrubs who nobody respects. The hesitation nearly cost a man his life. "Now," Katie repeated, and something in her voice changed. It dropped an octave. It became the voice of someone who had stood in the dust of Ramadi with blood on her hands and a casualty who needed to move, who had learned that the difference between hope and a flag-folded ceremony was the speed of her decisions. The RN moved. The intercom crackled, calling for Dr. Sterling, and Katie didn't wait for him. She washed her hands in the sink with water that felt like ice, her movements economical and certain, muscle memory decades old reaching up from the place inside her she had tried to bury. She pulled the pericardiocentesis kit from the crash cart with the kind of speed that comes from having assembled equipment in the dark while under fire. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Sterile field. Chlorhexidine to prep his chest. Her hands felt like someone else's hands and exactly like her own hands all at once, the contradiction making no sense and perfect sense simultaneously. "Talk to me, Commander," she said, keeping her voice low and steady, the kind of voice that tells a person they are not alone in their body's betrayal. "Tell me what you feel." "Pressure," he gasped. "Chest. Can't breathe. The room is." "I know. Your heart has fluid around it. We're going to fix that right now. You're not having a heart attack. Your heart is fine. The sac around it is the problem. In 4 minutes you're going to feel better. Can you trust me?" His eyes locked onto hers and something flickered in them, a spark of recognition that his fractured memory couldn't quite ignite into flame. He nodded. Dr. Sterling arrived like a storm, his voice preceding him through the door, already full of authority and certainty. "What the hell is happening?" "Stand down, I'll take this from." "Cardiac tamponade," Katie said, not looking up from the sterile field she had prepared on his chest. "His pericardium is filling. Blood pressure 71/48 and dropping. Distended neck veins. Muffled heart sounds. This patient is crashing. We'll call cardiothoracic, we'll prep for the OR." "There is no time for the OR," Katie said, and her hands were already finding the 5th intercostal space, the spot between the ribs where a needle becomes a prayer. She could feel Sterling's presence like static, his need for control radiating off him like heat. "This is a blind procedure. We do this now or he dies." Sterling stepped forward, his hand coming up. "You are not authorized to perform that procedure without my explicit instruction, and I am explicitly telling you to." The needle went in. One smooth motion. Through the skin. Past the fascia. Into the pericardial sac. The sudden release of pressure was audible, a soft hiss of air escaping, the sound of a pressure valve opening and life flowing back into a dying heart. Katie's hand found the syringe, and dark blood began filling the chamber as she drew back the plunger, removing the fluid that had been strangling the organ. 50 milliliters. 80 milliliters. 120 milliliters of blood that didn't belong there. On the monitor, the oxygen saturation began its climb. 68. 72. 79. 85. Each number was a heartbeat returned, a breath that was actually nourishing tissue instead of just moving empty air. 88. 92. Stable. The blood pressure cuff cycled automatically, and Katie watched it rise. 92/61. The monitor showed the rhythm stabilizing, the panicked scramble of a heart that knew it was dying transforming into the steady pulse of an organ that had been given a second chance. Commander Pierce's eyes closed and his breathing deepened, the desperate gasping finally giving way to oxygen flowing where it was supposed to flow. The needle came out. Gauze went down. Her hands moved with the efficiency of someone for whom this was not an emergency but a routine, a muscle memory so ingrained it had no choice but to obey. Sterile dressing. Tape. Documentation. Everything was clear and clean and certain. Sterling's face had gone the color of old paper. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound. The RN who had hesitated 2 minutes earlier was staring at Katie with an expression that had shifted entirely, a transformation happening in real time as some fundamental truth about this woman was being processed by her brain. Katie didn't look at either of them. She was looking at Commander Pierce, whose eyes had opened again, whose hand was reaching out across the bed like he was reaching toward something he couldn't quite name but needed desperately to touch. "You," he said, his voice still fractured but stronger now, present. "I know you." "I know? Your name is—" Katie reached across the bed and gripped his hand once, briefly, her palm against his palm in a gesture that belonged to another war and another lifetime and this moment all at once. "Rest," she told him. "Your heart is strong. You'll be fine." What happened next would ripple outward in ways Sterling had not anticipated, because he had not been paying attention to the only detail that actually mattered, that the man on the bed had her name written in permanent ink across his skin, and that he was beginning to remember exactly who it was written there by and exactly what that meant. Sterling's hands moved before his mind caught up. He was still in the trauma bay when the patient's monitor showed sinus rhythm, when Katie had already stepped back, when the entire room exhaled in unison. But Sterling wasn't breathing with them. He was thinking about hierarchy. About authority questioned in front of witnesses. About a nurse with hands steady enough to perform a procedure that should have required 3 physicians and a cardiothoracic surgeon on standby. He found the hospital administrator's personal cell before he left the building. Marcus Chen, his fraternity brother from Duke, now sitting in an office on the 4th floor with a view of the Savannah River and the kind of power that came from knowing which board members needed favors and which ones owed him money. The call lasted 90 seconds. "We have a protocol violation. Serious one. A nurse performed an invasive procedure without attending physician authorization. Exceeded her scope of practice in the most dangerous way possible." Sterling's voice was calm, reasonable, the voice of a concerned physician protecting patients. "I'm bringing in risk management. You'll want the board president briefed before word spreads." He hung up before Marcus could ask questions he didn't want to answer. Next came the temp agency. Katie had used Savannah Staffing Solutions for her first contract 3 years ago, a detail that should have told him something, but Sterling was too focused on building a case. He made the call from his office, door locked, speaking in the measured tone of someone requesting a reference check on a former employee with concerning gaps in her employment history. "I'm verifying work history for Katie Morrison. She listed your agency on her application. I'm finding some inconsistencies. Large employment gaps. Multiple positions with short durations. I need whatever documentation you have on her background, her references, anything that explains these gaps. The staffing coordinator hesitated. I'm not sure I can release. This is a matter of patient safety, Sterling said. A nurse with questionable employment patterns just performed an unauthorized medical procedure in my hospital. I need to know if there's a pattern here. The threat was soft but unmistakable. Within 2 hours, an email arrived in Sterling's inbox containing Katie's original application, her references, the gaps in her employment timeline. Nothing damaging, but the absence of information was almost as useful as scandal. No address before she arrived in Savannah. No forwarding information from her previous employer. A phone number that had been disconnected. References that were Navy installations, a detail Sterling made note of but didn't yet understand. The risk management consultant arrived at 3 o'clock the next afternoon. Dr. Helen Vasquez, brought in from an Atlanta firm, with a kind of ruthless efficiency that came from 20 years of protecting hospital liability. Sterling had already prepared a narrative, an unauthorized procedure performed by a nurse operating outside her qualifications, lack of attending physician oversight, potential patient harm narrowly avoided due to luck rather than competence. He didn't mention that the patient had survived. He didn't mention that the alternative, waiting for Sterling to make a decision, would have meant a dead man on the bed within 4 minutes. Cardiac tamponade, Vasquez said, reviewing the charts with the expression of someone tasked with finding liability in success. The patient recovered. You're saying the nurse performed the decompression without your authorization? Without my presence, Sterling corrected. I was assessing whether intervention was necessary. She panicked. Went rogue. Happened to get lucky with the technique, but that doesn't excuse the violation. Vasquez nodded, making notes. You have her file? Previous incidents? Pattern of boundary violations? Nothing documented yet, Sterling admitted. But I'm concerned about what we haven't found. Her background is unclear. Employment gaps suggest instability. This kind of reckless behavior doesn't appear out of nowhere. It took Vasquez 36 hours to build a file that looked damning on paper. A nurse who'd exceeded her scope of practice. A pattern of employment instability. A decision to intervene in a critical moment without consulting the attending physician. The fact that the intervention had saved the patient's life was reframed as dangerous luck. The patient could have been injured by an untrained person attempting an advanced procedure. By Friday morning, the file was ready for the formal termination meeting. Katie arrived at the nurse's station at 6:53 a.m., 2 minutes before her shift started, the same way she'd arrived every morning for 8 months, quiet, competent, invisible. The head nurse was waiting for her with a folder and the expression of someone delivering bad news. Conference room. Now. Inside, Sterling was present. So was Marcus Chen from administration, and Helen Vasquez in her crisp gray suit. Katie sat down. She didn't ask questions. She'd been through enough difficult conversations to recognize the architecture of one. Marcus spoke first. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. The decision is based on violation of scope of practice, exceeding authorized medical procedures, and creating patient safety risk through unauthorized clinical decisions. Sterling leaned forward slightly. You performed an invasive procedure on a patient without my authorization or presence. That's a fireable offense in any hospital in this country. Katie's hands rested on the table. Still, the patient would have died. That's not for you to decide, Vasquez said, her tone clinical. Protocol exists for a reason. You put the hospital at risk. You put the patient at risk. Your employment here is concluded. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Katie stood. Her badge was clipped to her scrubs, a laminated photo of a younger woman with a different expression in her eyes. She unclipped it slowly and set it on the table. Her keys followed, locker key, supply room key, the small brass tag with her badge number engraved on it. Sterling watched her do this with crossed arms, waiting for tears, for anger, for the kind of breakdown that would validate his narrative. Katie's face remained composed, a single measured breath through her nose, eyes dry, the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse. "I understand," she said. Her voice was steady. "I'll clear my locker." That afternoon, she stood at her locker in the basement break room where no one came during shift changes. 8 months of accumulated details, a photo of her sister from 4 years ago, a mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" with a chip in the ceramic rim, a dying succulent that had never gotten enough light, a small framed photo of a man with dark eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. Marcus. Her swim buddy from 3rd Platoon, SEAL Team 3. The photo was from 2015, before Kandahar. Before the IED blast that killed him and 4 others on a Tuesday morning when he was supposed to be on leave visiting his sister in Portland. Katie placed these items in a cardboard box. The box was the kind they used for medical supplies, printed with a red cross and the hospital logo. It felt wrong holding her life inside packaging meant for something clinical, something temporary. That evening, she stood at the bus stop on Victory Drive, the rain coming down in sheets that hammered the pavement like applause. The cardboard box was damp at the corners, starting to soften. She'd been standing there for 23 minutes, waiting for a bus that wasn't coming, not to anywhere, just away. Her Savannah life was ending in weather and darkness and a bus shelter that smelled like diesel exhaust and wet concrete. The rain hit her face and she didn't brush it away. Years of training meant she could stand in a hurricane without moving. But this wasn't a hurricane. This was the sound of a door closing on the only life she'd built where no one knew her name. Where no one asked about Ramadi. Where she could work 40-hour weeks and go home to an efficiency apartment and pretend to be someone who'd never carried a teammate's body down a mountain under gunfire. She opened the cardboard box despite the rain. The succulent was dead now, brown, crispy, beyond saving. The mug had a coffee stain inside the chip. The photo of Marcus was sealed in plastic, but she could see his face through the water droplets collecting on the surface. She thought about throwing it in the trash bin bolted to the corner of the shelter. Thought about walking away from that too, from the memory, from the guilt of surviving when he didn't, from the weight of carrying his name in her muscle memory every time her hands performed a procedure they'd learned together in a classroom at Joint Base San Diego Coronado in 2010. But then she held the photo closer. Really looked at it. And saw that Marcus was standing next to a young woman with her exact eyes. A woman who'd been 14 years old in that photo, who still didn't know where Katie really was, who probably thought her sister was deployed overseas on a medical contingency mission that stretched on indefinitely. Katie put the photo back in the box. She was still holding the box when she heard it, distant at first, a sound like the sky was cracking open. But not thunder. Rotor blades. Rotors. Multiple blades, heavy ones, the kind that meant aircraft, military aircraft. She looked up through the rain and saw running lights cutting through the darkness above Savannah. Coming low. Coming toward the hospital. She had no idea what was about to happen next. The rain continued falling as Katie stood motionless at the bus stop, the cardboard box held against her chest now, soaked through at the edges. The rotor sound grew louder, closer, and she realized the helicopters were descending. Not toward downtown. Toward Sacred Heart. Multiple aircraft, the sound of more than one, the rotor wash so heavy that even from 2 miles away she could feel the percussion in her chest like a second heartbeat. Emergency landing. Medical emergency. Medevac arrival. Any number of explanations. She told herself she was staying because she was cold and wet and waiting for a bus anyway. Not because some part of her, the part that still wore the weight of Lieutenant Commander's dolphins on a uniform she'd burned in a hotel room 3 years ago, recognized the sound of military helicopters as a summons. The rotors continued their approach, grew louder still, and Katie Morrison stood alone in the Savannah rain with a dying plant in a box and the photo of a man who would never come home, and waited for whatever was about to change everything. On the 3rd day, the sound came through the walls like thunder that refused to stop. Not weather. Rotors. Katie stood in her efficiency apartment on Broughton Street, cardboard box balanced on the kitchen counter, and watched through the rain-streaked window as two Black Hawks descended toward Sacred Heart's helipad with the deliberate precision of birds of prey landing on a carcass. The rotors beat the air into submission. Once. Twice. Again. The window rattled in its frame. She didn't move. Couldn't move. The helicopters touched down with a pneumatic hiss that made the glass shudder, and then, before the rotors even began to slow, a convoy of Hums rolled through Savannah's streets with the kind of purpose that made civilians pull their cars to the curb. 200 soldiers in dress blues flooded into Sacred Heart's lobby like a tide with a single direction. Medals caught the fluorescent light. Boots struck tile in synchronized rhythm. The sound reached Katie's apartment 3 blocks away, a bass note that vibrated through her chest cavity like sonar. She set down the box, walked to the window, and waited. The hospital administrator's office smelled like leather and fear. Dr. Richard Sterling sat behind his mahogany desk, suddenly very small in his own chair, while Commander James Pierce stood before him in dress whites that looked like they'd been pressed with a blowtorch. The commander's arm was still wrapped from the pericardiocentesis 3 days ago, but his eyes were clear. Focused. And beside him stood a Master Chief Petty Officer with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, shoulders broad enough to block out the ceiling fixtures, face carved from decades of decisions that meant life or death. "That is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison," Commander Pierce said, his voice steady and formal. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The floor supervisor walked in holding a manila folder that trembled in her hands like a living thing. Her name was Susan Chen, 23 years of hospital administration, and the color had already begun draining from her face before she opened the first page. Her eyes moved across the words, each one a small shock of electricity, and with every line she read, her voice got smaller. "Silver Star for extraction of 6 wounded operators under fire in Ramadi," she whispered. Pause. The room didn't breathe. Navy Cross for actions the file lists as classified. Chen's hand dropped against her thigh. 3 Purple Hearts. And a Distinguished Service Medal. Her voice broke on the last word. Signed by the Secretary of Defense. Sterling's jaw worked soundlessly. His hands, which had commanded rooms and humiliated nurses and activated board connections with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong, lay flat on his desk like surrender flags. The Master Chief took 1 step forward. Just one. The sound of his boots on Sacred Heart's polished floor echoed like a gavel. When he spoke, each word landed separately, each one a nail being driven into a coffin that had Sterling's name already engraved on it. "She saved Commander Pierce twice," the Master Chief said, his voice like a transmission downshifting into a lower gear. "Once in Ramadi when she carried him 3 kilometers on a shattered collarbone while rounds came in on 2 sides. And 3 days ago, when your ego got in the way of her doing it again." Sterling tried to speak. His mouth opened. Closed. Nothing emerged but a sound like air leaking from a punctured tire. The Master Chief's eyes moved to the administrator. "The woman you just fired performed an emergency pericardiocentesis on a patient in cardiac tamponade in 4 minutes. While your doctor screamed about protocols. The catheter went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, with the kind of precision that comes from having done it under fire. That patient is alive because of her hands. Not his." That's when the hospital IT specialist walked in. Sergeant David Holloway, United States Marine Corps, dishonorably separated 6 months prior, and the kind of quiet that surrounded him suggested he'd seen things that made Sterling's career destruction look like a parking ticket. In his hand was a flash drive. Single item. No packaging. No drama. Just a small piece of plastic that contained every second of security footage from the trauma bay on the night of the pericardiocentesis. "Dr. Sterling requested I delete this footage," Holloway said, and the sound of his voice was like a door closing on Sterling's remaining options. He made that request in person. 3 witnesses heard him. He told me it was a liability issue. That the patient's family would sue if they saw an unlicensed procedure. Holloway held the drive higher. I preserved every frame. Time-stamped every second. And I forwarded it all to the State Medical Board at 1847 hours yesterday, along with documentation of his deletion request. Sterling's face had gone the color of old hospital walls. What emerged next was less a breakdown and more a collapse, the kind that happens when institutional armor cracks and a man realizes he has no actual foundation beneath him. Sterling stood, and the movement was jerky, mechanical, like someone had forgotten to oil the joints. His voice came out at a pitch that made dogs in a parking lot lift their heads. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, but the words scattered like startled birds. She exceeded her scope. That was documented. The risk management consultant, he turned to the administrator. I brought in an outside consultant. The incident report was filed properly. Protocol requires. The Master Chief held up one hand. One single hand. And Sterling stopped speaking as if someone had flipped a kill switch. "We checked your incident reports," the Master Chief said. "The ones filed on the other nurses you removed from the hospital. Nurse Martinez and Nurse Jackson. Both cases documented as protocol violations. Both decisions made within 3 weeks of them reporting lower patient outcomes under your supervision. Both documentation," he paused, and in that pause was the entire weight of federal authority, fabricated. It was the hospital IT specialist who added the final piece. The timestamps on those files don't match the server logs. They were backdated. Retroactively modified. We have the server evidence. We forwarded that to investigators along with the security footage. Sterling's legs gave out. He sat back in his chair like someone had cut the strings holding him upright. His hands shook. His breathing came in short gasps that sounded like engine trouble. And then, with the kind of desperation that only comes when a man realizes his entire world has become transparent, he looked directly at Commander Pierce. "I didn't know," Sterling said. "If I had known." "You did know," the commander replied, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had trusted this man's competence 36 hours earlier. "You knew she was performing a life-saving procedure, and you screamed at her while she saved my life. That's the difference between not knowing and not caring." 6 months later, Katie stood at the window of Sacred Heart's director's office, her window now, and watched the rain fall across Savannah the same way it had fallen 3 months ago. But this time, she was looking at something specific. A strip mall parking lot on Victory Drive, where a folding table sat beneath a sagging canopy, where a man in a polo shirt with a name tag that read Steve was arranging pamphlets about supplemental insurance policies nobody wanted. Dr. Richard Sterling. His hands shook every time someone walked past. His eyes jumped at the sound of car doors. His medical license hung in a frame on the wall of the State Board office with a single red stamp across it, revoked. The charges had mounted like snow in a nor'easter. Falsification of medical records. Obstruction of justice. Abuse of position. The federal investigators had recommended criminal prosecution, but Sterling's legal team had negotiated a plea deal that kept him out of prison in exchange for a surrender of medical credentials that could never be reinstated, not in any state, not under any circumstance. The hospitals that had hired him on the strength of his fabricated performance had already begun distancing themselves. His medical school alma mater removed his name from their donor wall. 2 professional societies revoked his memberships. And now he sold insurance from a folding table to people who needed something, and his name wasn't worth the paper it was printed on anymore. Katie turned from the window and walked back into Sacred Heart's emergency department. The scrubs she wore were the same shade as before, a navy blue, practical, worn soft from 100 washings. But underneath the left sleeve, barely visible, was the edge of her old rank insignia, stitched back into the jacket she'd kept in storage for 9 years. Senior Chief. The letters that meant something once. The letters that meant something again. The nurses straightened when she approached. Not from fear. From something else. Respect, maybe. Recognition. A recognition that went beyond the paperwork that had been circulated, the promotion announcement, the biography they'd printed in the hospital newsletter, the official introduction to the staff. They'd all seen the security footage by then. The footage had been released by the state board as part of the public investigation. Every staff member had watched Katie's hands move with surgical precision, watched her call out vitals in a voice that carried the kind of authority that doesn't get taught in nursing school, watched her save a man's life while someone screamed about protocols that didn't matter anymore because the man wasn't dying according to policy, he was just dying. The patients recognized it too. The young woman in Trauma Bay 3 whose daughter had overdosed and was circling the drain until Katie walked in and made 3 calls and got the naloxone dosing adjusted and the girl's pupils came back. The elderly man whose sepsis was spiraling and who asked for the new director specifically because he'd heard about what happened. The teenager with the stab wound who heard Katie's name and asked if she was the same Morrison they were talking about, and when Katie nodded once and said, "Let's get you fixed," something in the boy's eyes steadied because he understood that the person holding his life was someone who'd held far more broken things and had never put one down. Katie checked the monitors. O2 sat steady on a post-op patient. Heart rate climbing slightly but within parameters. She wrote the note, signed it with her rank, SCO Morrison, Director of Emergency Medicine, and moved to the next bed. The movement was automatic. Practiced. The same movement she'd made 1,000 times in a dozen countries where the title didn't matter as much as the hands. In the waiting area, a man she'd pulled from an IED blast 12 years ago was sitting beside his wife. His tattoo had faded but her name was still visible across his forearm in block letters. Morrison. He'd gotten it during recovery, he'd told her once, before she'd vanished. He hadn't known her name then, just that she'd dragged him through fire and talked to him the entire time, telling him about her sister's terrible sense of humor and a dog that had eaten a shoe and 1,000 small normal things that kept him tethered to the world while everything else was burning. He didn't know the woman checking his discharge papers was the same one. But his daughter, who was 12 now and had looked it all up online, had told him. And when Katie walked past his chair on the way to the next room, he stood, not from pain, which was mostly gone, but from something else. Recognition. A small nod. The kind of greeting that passes between people who have stood on the same side of a line and lived. Katie returned the nod. Continued walking. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from having carried so much weight for so long that the simple act of setting it down in the right place, in front of the right people, in a room where people could finally see what had always been there, cost everything to do without breaking. That evening, she sat on the bench outside Sacred Heart's main entrance where the rain had finally stopped. A barista from the coffee shop across the street, a woman named Morgan with tattoos on her wrists that suggested military service, sat down beside her without asking. They didn't speak for 7 minutes. Just Saturday. Just breathed. Just existed in the space between what had been and what was becoming. Morgan wrote her number on a receipt and left it on the bench when she stood. Not a question. Just an offer. The kind that says, when you're ready to be known by someone, here's where to find me. Katie picked up the receipt and tucked it into her pocket beside her hospital ID. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Sometimes you just need hands that remember what they've done and a hospital that finally understands what it means to see someone clearly. Like, subscribe, and comment. If you'd been standing in Katie's shoes, would you have walked away? Would you have come back?